Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into a really critical idea, how democracies are changing, and specifically, how they die. We're going to be looking at the groundbreaking work of Nancy Bermeo to understand how the entire playbook for taking down a democracy has been rewritten for the 21st century.
So when I ask that question, how do democracies die? What's the first image that pops into your head? For most of us, it's probably tanks rolling down the Capitol streets, right? A general getting on TV to announce a takeover. And while that dramatic military coup is what we often picture, the threats that democracies face today are, well, they're a lot more subtle and honestly, in many ways, a lot more dangerous.
Bermeo gives us this really sharp definition to work with. And the key words here, you gotta see them, are state-led. This isn't some attack from the outside. No. Democratic backsliding is basically an inside job. It's a process where the government itself, the people in power, systematically weaken the very institutions, the courts, the press, free elections, that are supposed to hold them in check.
And that gets us to the most crucial point of all. The playbook has fundamentally shifted. So, forget the big, loud, violent demolition of democracy overnight. Instead, I want you to picture something more like termites. Yeah, termites. Slowly and quietly eating away at the foundations of a house. You don't even notice it's happening until one day the whole structure is just ready to collapse. That's the new threat.
Okay, so here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we'll nail down what backsliding is. Then, we'll look at why the old ways of killing democracies are fading. After that, we'll get into the new, sneakier forms. We'll even look at some real-world examples. And then, we'll wrap up with why this slow erosion is so incredibly hard to fight.
All right, let's start by setting a baseline. We're going to look at the kinds of democratic breakdowns that have become, surprisingly rare. Think of this as the 20th century playbook, and it's mostly just gathering dust on a shelf now.
So Bermeo points to three classic methods that were like the bread and butter of the Cold War era. You had your classic military coup, of course. You had executive coups. The fancy term is autogolpes. That's where an elected leader just decides to suspend the Constitution and rule by decree. And then you had good old-fashioned blatant ballot box stuffing on Election Day.
And you can see the trend so clearly in this chart. The chance of a military coup happening in a democracy has just plummeted since the mid-90s. Now, why is that? Well, it's mostly because the world changed. International norms, sanctions, it's all made that kind of open power grab incredibly costly for anyone who wants to be seen as a legitimate leader on the world stage.
And it's a similar story with election fraud. The rise of international election monitors has made openly cheating on the day of the vote a much, much riskier game. As this chart shows, allegations of really obvious fraud have dropped way down. And what this has done is force anyone who wants to rig an election to get way more creative.
Right, and as one observer put it so perfectly, the game has just completely changed. The real pros, the sophisticated authoritarians, they're not messing around with ballot boxes. Their work is done long before a single person even casts a vote.
Okay, so if that old playbook is fading out, what's taken its place? Let's turn now to the new, more insidious, and much more common forms of democratic backsliding that really define our current moment.
So the first new type is something Bermeo calls the promissory coup. This is fascinating. The coup makers don't get on TV and say, "We're dictators now." No. They use the language of democracy itself. They claim they're just stepping in temporarily to save the country from corruption or chaos, and they promise a quick return to a better, cleaner democracy.
But, and this is a huge but, look at the reality behind those promises. It is staggering. A whopping 85% of modern coups are promissory now. But the data shows those promises are almost always broken. Elections get delayed for years, the people who led the coup often end up winning the eventual election, and there's basically zero evidence that these things ever lead to a better democracy. It's a classic bait and switch, but with the fate of a country at stake.
All right, next up is the most common form of backsliding today, executive aggrandizement. This is that slow-motion power grab we talked about. It's carried out by leaders who are democratically elected, and they use their popularity, their mandate from the people, and the tools of the law to systematically, piece by piece, dismantle any check on their power.
And that leads us to the third, new form, strategic election manipulation. So this is the professional's way to rig an election. You're not stuffing ballot boxes anymore. Instead, you're tilting the entire playing field in your favor, harassing the opposition, making sure the media only says good things about you, and changing electoral laws just enough so that it's almost impossible for you to lose.
And this chart just shows that shift so perfectly. While the really blatant, on-the-day fraud is down, look what's up. Pre-election manipulation. Things like harassing opposition figures or using the courts to legally disqualify your main rival. The whole game has moved from the polling station to the entire political arena, months or even years before the vote.
Now, to really see how this executive aggrandizement thing works in practice, let's look at two really powerful examples from Bermeo's research: Turkey under President Erdogan and Ecuador under President Correa.
Now, on the surface, these two guys seem like they're from totally different political universes. You've got Erdogan, a right-wing populist, and Correa, a left-wing populist. But here's what's so brilliant about Bermeo's research. She shows they used an almost identical playbook. Both of them won elections and then used that popular support to claim they had the right to do whatever they wanted. And then they used that democratic legitimacy to pass new laws, rewrite constitutions, and systematically go after any institution, the courts, the media, you name it, that could possibly challenge their power. It is a textbook case of using the tools of democracy to kill democracy.
So in Turkey, Erdogan's party called it a quiet revolution. They used their majority in parliament to pass laws that basically made it a crime for journalists to be too critical. And they changed the rules so the executive branch got to appoint and fire the judges, which of course totally neutralized the judiciary as an independent check on power. And in Ecuador, Correa called his a citizens' revolution. He used a popular vote to create a whole new constitutional assembly, and then he used that assembly to just sideline the existing Congress and completely rewrite the country's laws. The state ended up with massive new powers over political parties, the media, and even nonprofit organizations.
So all of this slow, quiet, legalistic erosion of democracy, it presents this unique and frankly incredibly difficult challenge for anyone who wants to try and fight back.
The problem, in one word, is ambiguity. See, unlike a coup, there's no single oh my god moment of crisis. Every individual step, a small change to a judicial appointment law, a new media regulation, it all seems too technical or too minor to get people out into the streets. And everything is done through legal channels, it's justified by elections. This makes it so hard for the opposition to fight back without being accused of just being sore losers. It even makes it hard for us, as social scientists, to clearly measure it.
But, there is a bit of a silver lining in all of this, according to Bermeo's research. Her data shows that when modern democracies do fail, the authoritarian regimes that come after them tend to be less brutal, and they don't last as long as the nasty dictatorships from the Cold War. It's almost like even when democracy collapses, some of its norms hang around and put a limit on just how bad things can get.
And so, this all leaves us with probably the most critical question of our time. When the assault on democracy isn't coming from tanks, but from laws, from referendums, and from the very language of the will of the people, how can citizens, opposition parties, and the world effectively fight back? That's the challenge that people in democracies all over the globe are wrestling with right now.